I just want to thank you all for attending my talk, and I want to thank the Portland Art Museum, as well as Betsy Knopf, for selecting me to be considered for this. So it was interesting when I first was asked to do this. I figured that this, there's a lot of pieces in the permanent collection that I find very inspiring, a lot of artists that are represented within the collection, and I figured that something would just immediately jump out at me, and I knew I wanted a work that would somehow relate to my own work, so I could create a talk that connects that and also highlights some of the influence upon my own work. But then I wanted a work that was identified from the modernist period, because it's been very influential to my work, and my talk's going to address that. And then also I had immediately, for some reason, I had this stipulation that I wanted the artist to be deceased. I don't know why I had that at the time, but I guess there's something about a certain finality in a career, obviously at that point. As you'll see, I've opened this up. Richard Serra is still living and extremely active. Some of the works that first just to give them kind of honorable mentions as far as works that I was considering were Robert Rauschenberg's piece within the collection, Louise Nevelson, Anne Truitt, and John McCracken, all artists who are associated with kind of the modernist period and to some degree also elements of minimalism. So at some point it became very obvious to me that Serra's piece, it became very clear that this was the piece that I needed to talk about, and that this artist had influenced me quite a bit in my own, the process of developing my own work from the time as a college student, in my early 20s, until today. And I think there was something, I've always had a bit of a love-hate relationship with Richard Serra. I think it was because there's a certain reputation that surrounds him and his work, and I think it was something that was kind of presented to me when I was first in undergraduate in the early 90s. Elements of kind of a representation of kind of macho-ness, this kind of last vestige of like, the kind of supposed kind of heroic modernist sculptor. And then also things I had heard from, there was also the controversy, which I'm going to touch on, about Tilted Arc, which you cannot talk about Serra's work without addressing that. And then also I have friends who have worked with him specifically and have, had experiences, obviously, working with him. And I know he can be a difficult individual, but through this kind of research in his work, and also things that I said, I had a kind of a love-hate relationship, but also like with the research, I came out with even more admiration for this artist, their practice, and their influence upon the field of contemporary art. I think he's easily could be considered one of the most influential first modernist and then contemporary sculptors. So why I selected Untitled 1969? Well, one, it's the one piece that was on display of his. It's also a piece that relates to works specifically within my own practice, and I'm going to start out with showing a few works from mine that are influenced specifically by not only Richard Serra, but also modernist abstraction, minimalism to a degree. And I was always fascinated with these works, and I'm going to talk about a bit more about this work and kind of the different way that you're seeing it than how it was originally exhibited, because there is a difference in the way we're experiencing this piece now as opposed to when it was first exhibited. From what I can see, and I believe I have, it was actually somewhat difficult to research and find the information I wanted specifically about this piece and imagery, but I believe I found a piece from the actual documentation of this work from an installation view from a exhibit that was at the Leo Castelli Gallery in December of 1969 to January of 1970. But the works there, and you'll see these are displayed very differently, and there's a very different kind of physical element to these works than what we're experiencing now. So, First, I'm just going to show you a few pieces of my work. Some people may be familiar with it, some may not. But these are works that are specifically amongst my body of work that are influenced by not only, there's a few pieces here that are specifically influenced by Richard Serra, but then also, like I said, modernism, modernist abstraction, and minimalism. This first piece is Safety First, Symmetrical Utilitarian Abstraction. I know we have a little bit of a blockade here, but I'm going to be showing a lot of images on there. I invite you to stand if you have problems seeing. This was displayed at the Navy Pier. This piece was, I'm kind of going chronologically. I'm showing about 5 pieces going forward, but this is from 2004 from the Navy Pier in Chicago. And Peter Shadall, critic for the New Yorker, selected 15 artists to make temporary outdoor pieces. Most of my work is interior. It's all gallery, museum based. So I really relished the challenge of creating a outdoor artwork. And then also I was thinking about how would I translate my work to that. And one thing when I think about kind of public sculpture, I grew up with a lot of, and you see it's been embraced, a lot of municipal buildings, public buildings, business, corporate buildings have embraced particularly pieces that grew out of modernist abstraction. So I wanted to make a piece that somehow harkened back to that, and then at the same time I wanted to challenge myself with creating an abstraction, and then also a piece that would be at the same time ergonomically relating to the human being. So it would be figurative in a sense. So that's one angle. Another angle, it's the design of it is 2 intersecting crosses, and without these, you see there's 6 stainless steel grab bars on 6 sides of this piece that provide a literal grasp point for the viewer. You remove those, it becomes somewhat of a very obviously minimal and somewhat generic abstract form. You place those on there, and these are specifically, they're used and ergonomically designed for a human to grab hold of this piece, and it's, to me, it's kind of counters the element of abstraction where, there's less to grab hold of when you're dealing with non-representation as opposed to representation. So in some ways, I'm giving the viewer a literal grasp point upon this piece. Also, I like to play around sometimes with the materials and the sources that I use. The stainless steel grab bars were made by Franklin Brass, and particularly the Safety First line, and their symbol was a cross. So that helped influence the design of this piece.
How tall is it?
It says 5 by 5 by 5 feet. This next piece is Latitude and Longitude. These figurative parts are the components you see on this, the hands, the feet. They're 75% larger than scale. This piece was directly, I was thinking from the get-go about minimalism, and specifically the inclination towards reductivism, and also units and spareness. So I was interested in this. I've done a series of works where I've had fragments of the body, parts of the body, and I'm interested in what these kind of limited elements of the body and what they can, what sort of a motive quality they can create. Also, with my work, I often use a lot of display devices. I view those as part of my work. There's no delineation between these objects what you would perceive first as the sculptural objects upon these platforms. The platforms are part of the sculptures, and they become almost like they are these geometric, minimalist, abstract forms that are existing in space, and that was part of the interest of the minimalists, was dealing with how we negotiate work, how we navigate it, how it affects our physical experience. And so these were all things that were that all fed into as I was devising this piece. There's some detailed views of this. I particularly wanted workwear on this figure, or the fragments of this figure, to be a really to really kind of counteract the kind of sterility and spareness of the piece. This next piece is prop, and this specifically, the title of this piece is the title of a Serra piece, which I'll be showing later. Somewhat different concerns. While it's a therapeutic cane that's leaned up against a wall, it came specifically, and amongst some things I explore in my work are, well, amongst mortality, dystopia, and modernism are kind of continuing themes within my work. This work is definitely a piece that's exploring mortality, and it comes from my own experience of seeing specifically my great aunt's cane leaning up against a wall as a child. I was about 3 years old, and obviously, it makes sense because of the path I followed, but I always had a very strong relational experience to physical objects as a child, and continues till this day. But these really made an impression upon me, and I know at the time it towered over my head. It was an object that felt very distant from my reality at the time, obviously. Represented old age, ill health, and as a 3-year-old child, these things seem very distant. Another aspect of this work, this work is specifically, I was thinking about modernism and some of the kind of philosophical tenets of it. This is obviously a geodesic dome, which came from the design of Buckminster Fuller, a famous modernist architect. It's about 6 feet across, 4 feet high. It's made of 65 turned hemlock balusters, architectural balusters, that are then connected with custom brass fittings. And one thing I was inspired at the time was a Austrian Czechoslovak architect, Adolf Loos, who wrote a seminal essay titled Ornament and Crime, where specifically he's taking the stance as a very staunch modernist and chastising designers, other elements of society, with the application of decoration and ornamentation as being, in his eyes, somewhat degenerate in a way. So, in a sense, with this piece, I'm kind of snubbing my nose at Adolf Loos, and elements of it is kind of hardline modernism by making this very ornamental depiction of this iconic modernist form, and also the geodesic structure has been, beyond, beyond its applications that you see it. It's been embraced by subcultures such as, of course, Burning Man subculture, hippie subculture, and it kind of represents to me, I think it's come to represent elements of kind of utopic aspirations. And this is, I made another version of this piece, another geodesic structure. In this case, it's made of 65 cast plastic human femur bones. Because of course, the modernist period in the vast 20th century, I think it was tied in. The philosophies were very much kind of embrace the idea of this kind of linear progression and this kind of like path to some sort of perceived utopia. But obviously, some of the most dystopic situations that humanity has seen arose out of those aspirations. So, in a sense, I'm making a piece that is somewhat highlighting that fact through the kind of macabre nature of it. Similar ideas as the previous piece, but in this case, obviously, different ways I'm interpreting it. This next piece, this was the prop pieces were specifically, and their element of being these blockades and barriers, these things that really, and that's an element to Serra's work, and as we move into that, you'll see, and I'll talk more about that. But this piece is titled Device, and this is specifically, it's about 7 feet tall, and it's a hybrid between a section of a kind of a cast section of a cinder block wall, and then a billboard sign. So it's a hybrid between those things. And of course, a sign is a message. It's making a statement. And I'm also likening that to obviously the exterior of a building, the facade of a building, a wall. That is a statement. That is a barricade. That keeps individuals out. And I made this piece during the time of the lead up to the election when there was discussion about creating such a barrier. And in some ways, I'm kind of obviously, because this is not a barrier that provides any sort of blockade. It's in fact very thin. It's a facade, and it can be easily gone around. And so it's on a steel scaffold structure. Also, I was thinking specifically about modernism because obviously the structure that it's on. This is about 7 feet across by 6 feet high. The panel. It's also I saw as representing. It's essentially like a painter's panel, and there was an embrace in modernism of the kind of move away from the idea of pictorial space being a window into another world, and instead embracing the surface of a two-dimensional work and the materiality of that, and the fact embracing it and not trying to attempt to create some sort of window into another world and representation. So there's two different things I was exploring with this. Then finally, this last piece is Cracks in the Stable. This was made at the Gerasi Resident Artist Center, or rather the mold sections, the slab casts. This was in a space where my studio was in previously was a cattle stable. This was on a 600-acre property. It's where the residency is, overlooking the Pacific from the Santa Cruz Mountains. And one thing is, at that point, I would continually see this horizon line off in the distance. You'd see the ocean off in the distance. So that became, and then every evening the sun would set. It would send this light in. It's kind of in the golden hour where it's coming at this very low angle, and would catch these deep cracks within the floor of the space. And I knew I wanted to depict these and document them. But then also I wanted to register them and arrange them as they were within the space as I experienced them. And then also I was reflecting and thinking of in the same way that these would be these minimalist structures, these geometric forms that you could move through in and around, and would be, again, somehow altering your perception of space. And they came out looking, they're hollow, but I designed them to look like almost like these cross sections that have been excised out of the floor. And they have these cracked surfaces, so they are documenting the surface of the artwork. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a little bit of kind of element of how I was influenced by modernism, minimalism, and Serra's work specifically. Now we're moving into talking specifically about Serra. And so what I want to do is I want to kind of highlight aspects of his career. I'm going to focus on the early parts of his career. We're going to also be focusing on the section in which this work came out of and emerged from, going up to about Tilted Arc, and then just showing a few pieces after that, because he's obviously continued to be very active as an artist. I believe he's 77 years old, and so it's very admirable that he's still going so strong. So Serra grew up in San Francisco, and he came from a working class family. His father was a Spanish native of Majorca in Spain, and his mother was a Los Angeles-born Jewish immigrant from Odessa, Russia. That was part of the reason why I think I related to Serra too, is because he came from this working class background. He did not come from a privileged background, yet he has emerged and obviously gone on to have an extremely successful career, and did not. That was not impediment or a detriment to his path. Serra describes, and this is this image right here, Serra describes one of the most primal and generative experiences that he had as a child was watching the launching of a ship in the Marin shipyard when he was 4 years old. And this was where his father worked as a pipe fitter. And they just, at one time he was with his father, and there was a launch that was happening of a very large ship. And he witnessed this massive obdurate shape being launched into the water and becoming buoyant and adrift. To go from something that was massive to something that was weightless had a huge effect upon him, and became what he describes as a reoccurring dream. And it makes so much sense, the fact that his works now, there's this element that obviously he makes these very monumental works fabricated from steel, primarily now, or that is kind of his exclusive material, specifically Corten steel. And then also, as I'll continue to discuss, he actually worked within steel mills and became familiar with that material. So I just want to give a little background before I move into some of his earliest work, first in Europe and then when he moved to New York after that. So a little bit of his educational background, because it had a huge influence upon his work. So in 1957, Serra enrolled in the University of California at Berkeley. Originally, he was a literature major there. He soon transferred to the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he studied with Howard Warsaw and Rico Lebrun, among others. As a way to support himself during his studies, he worked in steel mills, and this is where he familiarized himself with this material that became obviously his main medium. And obviously, also talking about too that last image of that boat, it makes so much sense because the pieces that he's making now and has been making for a number of years are made through the same process in which these large steel sheets are bent and manipulated and formed, came from this process. So after receiving his BA from Berkeley in 1961, Serra was accepted in the MFA program at Yale University, where he was actually accepted in painting to begin with. He has said that the instructors that had the greatest influence upon him during that time were painter Philip Guston, experimental composer Morton Feldman, and designer Joseph Albers. Among the student cohort were artists Chuck Close, Bryce Martin, Nancy Graves, and Robert Mangold. So he had a very high caliber group of peers at the time of his study, and obviously studied with some really amazing artists. Also had the opportunity of studying with Robert Rauschenberg. So an important element I thought it was interesting as I was researching his work was this element of drawing. And that's an important aspect to his work, and he really says that all his ideas generate and grow out of that. And he talked about early on that he has a brother who was taller, better looking, more, better in school, but he had the ability to draw. So he would always do that after dinner every night, and he was encouraged to do so. And it was a way to kind of get the attention and admiration that he desired from his parents. But he honed his drawing skills through that. And I think this is an interesting quote. This is from About Drawing. It's a 1977 interview that he did. And this quote, I think it's interesting because it's reflective of his general philosophy, but specifically an interesting perspective on drawing. Drawing is a way of seeing into your own nature, nothing more. There are certain formal processes that one learns that end up being a hindrance. There is no way to make a drawing, there is only drawing. So an interesting perspective on that. So, moving forward, immediately following his graduate studies in Yale, Serra spent time living and working in France and Italy. First in France on a Yale travel scholarship, and then in Rome on a Fulbright scholarship for study in Rome. It was during this time that Serra began to realize that he needed to open up his work and really expand the kind of materials he was exploring, the material exploration. And understand, too, he was coming out of study as a painter at Yale, but he was immediately moving, while continuing to draw, moving towards materials and the creation of objects. Among the materials that he explored at the time was the use of both live and dead or taxidermied animals. And I found these through poring through the web. I found an image. This is from entitled "Feeding Cage Number 1," and I assume it's from an exhibition, "The Living End." But this was in Rome, and so this is obviously a live animal. That's Serra as a very young artist in his 20s. Another image from this, obviously another live animal, but I guess there was, these were the only images I could find in these, but they were also incorporated taxidermied animals. And at the time, I guess it created an element, he says it created an element of uproar. The exhibition was at first shut down, and then it was reopened. And then ironically, about a year later, the Arte Povera movement arose from that region and in Europe, where oftentimes they were having both live and taxidermied animals, as well as other more unfamiliar materials. So it's interesting, kind of indicative of him being ahead of his time. So moving forward, he had moved to New York, but emerging from an education steeped in academic abstract expressionism, Serra began to work in a reductive manner that related to minimalism, but at the same time embraced processes and materiality. Artists associated with this approach, often referred to as post-minimalists, avoided using art as a metaphor or a symbol. Instead, they embraced the idea of a sculpture as a phenomenological experience of weight, gravity, space, process, and time. At the same time, Serra's sculpture still evoked an aspect of the sublime through their scale and materiality. This is actually a portrait, one of his cohorts from Yale. Of course, you're familiar with Chuck Close. This is a large-scale portrait that, interestingly enough, was made in 1969, the same time that this piece, Untitled, was made in 1969. So moving forward, so he had relocated to New York at this time, secured a studio space. New York was a very different kind of atmosphere and a very different thing as far as rents and as far as the ability of a young artist to exist at the time. It was a possibility that you could really live and work in that situation. And he had interesting ways in which he did that. But so after his time in Europe, Serra moved to New York City. Among his circle of friends were artists Carl Andre, Walter de Maria, Eva Hesse, Saul LeWitt, and Robert Smithson. Again, another group of artists, a whole group of artists that went on to be extremely successful in their own right. As a way to pay rent and live, Serra started a furniture and moving business called Low Rate Movers. Among his employees were Chuck Close and composer Philip Glass, and actor and writer Spalding Gray. So he had a very interesting, employees and business in which he used that was his day job, so he could practice as an artist. So as you see here, this is an installation view, and the clarity of this image, I'm not sure if this was actually an exhibition image or in a studio space, but it's rubber, it's vulcanized rubber. And there was a warehouse near his loft that was emptying out he describes a couple hundred tons of vulcanized rubber. And he described this as being almost like a grant. This was this free material that he received. It had $0 attached to it. He just had to move it and use it. He moved it into his space, and with this huge amount of free material, Serra began to experiment with the physical possibilities of this material. So this is belts from 1966, 1967, the time it was generated. The next few pictures, they're all in black and white. You can see off to the left there is, you can see this kind of glowing form. That is neon. So he was incorporating that within his work at the time with rubber. But rubber was his kind of main material he was working with. I just want to hand this out now. So with his new material as his inspiration, he created a verb list. So you see here, and we're passing this around. I wanted you to see this. And this was very influential to me when this was presented to me as an undergraduate student by a professor as a way to generate ideas, to think about setting up kind of elements of kind of rules or actions in which you would generate your work. So looking at some of these, to roll, to crease, to fold, to store, to bend, to shorten, to twist, to dapple, to crimple, to shave, to tear, to support, to hook, to suspend. They go on. And there's all these different ways, and that's how he used really this kind of these actions, and also this idea of you're engaging with these materials through these set of actions. So again, really the kind of aspect that he was embracing, where materials really were what they were. They were not functioning as a metaphor for something else. And we engaged them in a way that was somehow very banal, just like we would with any other kind of thing, like just similarly as you would, fold a towel. It's similar. Like there's these kind of actions and functions that we go about our day doing. So the flexibility of this is To Lift from 1967. Simple action of just lifting it up in a corner, and he saw that it would hold in space. This is some of that vulcanized rubber, and so he worked with that for quite some time, because they said he had a couple hundred tons of this material. So the flexibility of rubber led him into working with another material that had a similar flexibility. The material was lead. So of course it had this weight. Lead's interesting. It also has this toxic element as well. I don't know if that was I'm not sure if that fed so much into his thinking or his interest. But I think it was mainly that it was a material that had weight and a material that would hold its form when you would manipulate it. Yeah, and this is tearing lead from 1.0 to 1.47 from 1968. You'll see this piece here. This is hand-catching lead. He also experienced, or rather experimented with video. And this is a 3-minute video of just Serra's hand and a friend of his tossing chunks of lead and him trying to catch it before it falls through his grasp. So again, this kind of like this again similar, and this grew out of the verb list of these set of actions and functions. And he was particularly, I know he said that he was inspired by the video work of Yvonne Renier. So it led him to create a series of video works. Another thing that Serra did with lead was that he actually would heat it up and splash it across the surface of a wall. In this case, he did this, and by this time, by 1968, he had formed a relationship and became represented by Leo Castelli, longtime, very well-known New York art dealer. But Leo Castelli had a warehouse that he allowed artists to both exhibit in and experiment in these spaces, in addition to his more formal exhibition space. So this is splashing from 1968, and this was from an exhibition called 9 at Castelli, which focused on 9 artists or post-minimalist artists who would be referred to as really working in the realm of kind of process art. They were very interested in the process being evident in their work and having that be something that formulated their ideas and the concepts that they were working in. This is him within that space. He would often raise the ladle above his head in a very kind of dramatic fashion. He has continued to work on these pieces in different locations. One thing he started to do with these works, this is casting from 1969, is that he would make these, and they were along. It's like specifically he does them in the relationship between the floor and the wall. And specifically, and they're called the gutter. I think he said he was attracted to that term. But he would start to experiment with prying them up, and then he could do a number of these cast from the floor's surface. I mean, there was elements that influenced my work, Cracks from a Stable, that I showed you. That kind of idea of using a casting of an actual floor surface. And then oftentimes they're lined up, they're in different kind of configurements, but they're all made through the same process. So, let's see. This is him. He's done these pieces, I think over the course of 30 years. This is Measurements of Time, Seeing is Believing from 1996 while he's working on this. And it's very important that I understand that he's ladling the heated lead. He's putting the molten lead, and he's the one that's doing that repetitive act. So one thing that Serra says is prior to the prop pieces, which we're getting into now, this is obviously entitled Prop from 1968. You see the influence of that one piece I showed you previously, Prop. But he says prior to the prop pieces, and specifically House of Cards, which I'll show next, Serra has said that he was still working in a manner that was reflective of 2 dimensions, in that he had artworks that were both on the floor and the wall, and that were still dealing with the figure-ground relationship that you often see in painting. And he was still dealing with these things that you would view them in a way that they were still working in pictorial space. These are some installation views. So like I said, he's working with these. He's still viewing these as somewhat as being, they're starting to move away from this pictorial space that he's still been working in, this kind of like, and obviously coming from a background of 2 dimensions. This piece he considered to be influential and kind of moving him into dimensional space. So he said it was after creating House of Cards, this is a 1-ton prop House of Cards from 1969. He said after creating House of Cards that he really started to explore the experience of volume and space. He then describing wanting to open up that volume and be able to walk into, through, and around. So I believe through searching for this, it was very difficult to find this. Of course, the piece is entitled Untitled, and he has more than one piece that's titled Untitled. So while I was searching through this, I wanted to find the history of this piece. I wanted to see, one, I was interested in where it was made, where it was exhibited first, who it was owned by, what collections it had been in, and what the weight of this was. And we're gonna, as we move through this, we're gonna then focus specifically on this piece. But it's from this exhibition, I believe, and this is an installation view from the Castelli warehouse, from an exhibition that ran from December 16th, 1969 through January 10th, 1970. And this was a series of prop pieces. And the interesting thing about these works is that these are very large plate steel. This is Corten steel, so I'm assuming, and I'm thinking that this is actually the potentially could be, I mean, of course, it could be obviously something where it was recreated, but it's the same configurement as the piece that we see in front of us. And these pieces, an interesting thing about this, and I'll talk more about this, but these pieces were propped. There was nothing more than weight and friction and gravity holding them together. So not only was there this kind of, this sense of physicality, but there was this sense of these could fall. This could be something very dangerous. Another installation view. And this piece is 1969, so it seems to line up with this. This obviously emerged from this. And you see how they were exhibited in some cases with barriers around them. So that obviously, anybody could go around those, but of course, to keep people away because these could be potentially very dangerous. So there's no way to talk about Richard Serra without addressing his piece, Tilted Arc, that you're seeing here. It's the only piece that that's been one. It was commissioned by the United States government, and then ultimately it was destroyed by the United States government. So and it radically changed the kind of the future of public art from that point, and created these issues that were addressed that had not been addressed previously. So this was at the Federal Plaza. It's at the junction of Lafayette and Foley Streets in Foley Square, in New York. So Tilted Arc was commissioned by the U.S. General Services Administration in 1979 and installed in 1981. The 12-foot high, 120-foot long sculpture was removed on March 15, 1989, after 5 years of public hearings, lawsuits, and plenty of media coverage concerning the legality and appropriateness of such an action. Now, a little over 10 years later, the site has experienced a complete makeover, and there's another artist there, it's Marshall Schwartz, redesign of the Federal Plaza, that has erased all physical and historical traces of Tilted Arc. So, I mean, the arguments about this, and it was interesting because he had done at least one other kind of arc piece within a large square that was installed and was not complained about and continues to exist till this day. But this one, particularly in this, there was complaints and a large degree of complaints that were submitted from individuals that worked around this area. That, of course, this is an impediment. It's something that's and there's this idea also, obviously, of public art, and I can see the thinking of this, but that it's somehow it enhances the experience of people within a public space. And it obviously does not make your experience somehow more difficult. But this is something that is confrontational. This is a barrier, and this is something that you have to address and walk around. You cannot just go across this plaza. It has this structure within it, or had rather. Some interesting shots of this. Also, I know that the complaints too that it was a surface. You can see some tags on it. Is that it was a surface that was and it was inviting graffiti. And at this time, Serra was working in corten steel, which is a form of steel that has kind of an arrested it's kind of designed to have its rusting properties kind of arrested in kind of a suspended state, so that it's not going to continue to deteriorate. This is corten steel that we see here. So it's made specifically for outdoor works. And if you see works that have a rusted finish upon them, and they're maintaining that, and they don't have it's not increasing, that's corten steel. Interesting image of a person there facing the barrier in front of them. But the dialogue that was created from this, and as a result, the way it was addressed, really moved public art from one that was where they previously they didn't have to address some of these issues as far as functionality of a space, how it was being experienced by the public. So it really led to, at one point, public art, it was really embracing things of being functional. So things you could sit on, things that had a very definitive functionality to them. And something that was not something that was, viewed as being something confrontational. And there's always that issue within public art. There's that balance between the artist's creative vision, but then obviously they're working in a shared public space. So how do you maintain elements of that? And I think that this piece, this made Serra obviously beyond the parameters of the art world, made him known to the greater public because of the controversy that surrounded this. And this one piece has shifted and continued to shift and permanently shifted the kind of the way public art was perceived and how the work that was being requested from that point forward. So it's interesting, when we're thinking back to Serra's work, specifically in the steel mills, and then also his idea, like he says, he wanted to make work that he could move in, through, and around. He wanted works that would somehow really envelop you, form passageways, create something that you had to navigate and be aware of your physical body in the way that you are moving through a space. This was a piece entitled Snake. It was made specifically for the Guggenheim in Bilbao, Spain. It was designed specifically for this space. And this is the piece being constructed. So it's not a permanent installation, but you can see these kind of passageways. You can walk through this piece. Then also another piece that really, again, like that was kind of, these are obviously after Tilted Arc, and this is kind of the last piece that we're looking at as far as images. But this is Torque d'Ellipse, which was created for the Dia Beacon in New York. And this was another piece where very much you could move into these passageways, you could move around them. There's a beautiful, really amazing piece of his that's at the Olympic Sculpture Park in Seattle. Next time you're up there in Seattle, make sure to attend the Olympic Sculpture Park and experience his work there. So another thing I wanted to kind of finish with this. Not only have I been influenced by Serra's work, but there's also there's an interesting thing that artists have interpreted his work or incorporated with him, both as kind of some elements of kind of satirization, or in this case, or also very very much homage too. In case of one artist, I'll show you. But this is Los Angeles artist Rachel Lakowitz, and a piece from 1992. It's made of lipstick and wax. It's entitled Serra. It's a play upon, obviously, his name. It's spelled S-A-R-A-H. And this is an element of kind of he's applying an element of feminist critique to his artwork. And again, that's harkening back to kind of these kind of perceptions of him as being this, this kind of macho individual, kind of like this last gasp at kind of like the heroic abstract sculptor. And she's taken this, but she did a series of works and has continued to do this, where she's remaking works, but in these materials that are, have these kind of, that are perceived as feminine. And again, this kind of application of a feminist critique to these. And they're all male artists that she's depicting. Then Maurizio Cattelan, one of my favorite artists because humor is something I really like to embrace in my work. But this is obviously a take on the piece Prop, and this is Broom from 2009. So you see this canvas affixed to a wall, tilted at an angle with this broom dinghied into it. But harkening back to that same lead piece Prop, another documentation of it. So, a form of feminist critique, a form of kind of satirization or humor of his work. And then Serra was actually in the last film of the Cremaster series by Matthew Barney, so Cremaster 3 from 2002, in which he was, in this case, he was the material, instead of molten lead, it was Barney's trademark Vaseline that was being ladled. And so Serra played a prominent role within this film. So, showing some images, I just wanted to move to this piece now, just talk about this physically. And again, like as I kind of thought about, I was happy that I was able to find where I think this piece was first exhibited that was important. And also I knew that there was something about this, because I always knew that these works, the part of the thing about them, these earlier works, was that they were set up with purely with gravity, weight, friction. They were balanced. So when I saw this, and if you see, like, there are these welds here. So I speculate that this piece was for obvious reasons, unless this was barricaded off, this piece could not be exhibited in this fashion without something permanently affixing those. And I noticed that in the image that I think is of this, the components of this piece, again, it could be recreated too. I mean, obviously, it's that's commonly done, but the steel plate was tilted inward, because I wondered, I figured even without this, that having them very straight like this, because they're perfectly straight. If you look down them, there's no angle to them, that would physically not be possible. They would have to be torqued in, and they were in the image that I saw. So it was a little bit of kind of forensics. I kind of wanted to trace the history of this piece and a little bit about kind of the physicality. I wanted to know the weight of this. The plates are a combined 655 pounds of this Corten steel. These are 1 inch by 4 by 4 sheets, forming a kind of 4 by 8 foot kind of surface or barrier. And then this large steel rod in the back, about 4 inches in diameter, and then I estimate about 5 feet in length, is 400 plus pounds. So it's interesting to know this kind of the physical weight and mass of this material. And so a little bit about the history of this. This was purchased by the museum in 1980. And it is part of the Evan H. Roberts Memorial Sculpture Collection. It's been on display in this location. I wanted to know how was this displayed? It was been displayed on this in the museum in the interior. I'm not sure if it's been exactly at this location, but since 2008 interior. But my understanding is that prior to that, it was exhibited. I don't know from the whole time, but it was exhibited outside. So, and it is Corten steel, so it's able to do that. It's interesting because seeing these and seeing those other prop pieces in context, it's interesting seeing one of these pieces in contrast to that. The experience of seeing these in a space, as I presented earlier, where you have all these precarious pieces, all kind of exploring these kind of different ways of propping and balancing, and again using only friction, weight, and gravity. It creates a much more, and again, one thing, if you talk about Serra's work, you talk about elements. He does reference architecture. He's very adamant that his work is not architecture, though, because it's not. He doesn't want this functionality attached to it. But it's interesting how this work changes in seeing this in an isolated kind of situation, where this came from more of a, what I view as, pretty much it seems like his works, while they are these kind of more isolated objects, this emerged from something that was more of an installation, I see, and there was a kind of dialogue between these different ones, the different pieces, and so one thing I'm just interested in, what changes with this, with that kind of weld? How does that change our perception? Was this condoned by the artist? These are all questions that I have about this piece. This was specifically from this prop series, like I said, the piece I showed you, Device, that wall billboard piece. That was something I was thinking about, was specifically some works that came from this series, because, again, like Serra's interest was in having materials be kind of what they are. There's not so much a metaphor for something else. They're not representing something else. They are like these, in this case, these very heavy, large steel forms that have this weight and this physicality to them. But also this does have an element of the barrier, and that's something that shows up in his work. And it's interesting, he talks about moving in, through, and around, but, and I think, of course, obviously tilted art, the idea of it being a barrier or a wall was very much addressed, but interestingly is that he doesn't talk about that a lot, at least through what I researched. But that's one of the things, that's how I was interpreting them, and that's one thing that, again, influenced that piece and that interest. And again, that kind of, while he's referencing architecture within his work, again, he's adamant that they're not, they have that kind of element, because the idea of moving in, through, around a piece, moving around something and experiencing it from different angles, changes and alters your experience, very similar to architecture. And I think it's interesting, there's still elements to his work too, while his work is very curvilinear now, these very large steel forms, Some of these earlier pieces, I think they again, like he talked about, especially with the House of Cards piece, is where he was moving into more kind of sculpture and around a more sculpture and volume and space. But this piece, I think, was still kind of in the realm. It's dealing with the surface, with the pictorial space as well. So they're an interesting kind of hybrid between both painting, sculpture. Again, there's elements of architecture, but there's a really kind of this interesting hybridization of painting and sculpture within these works. And then, of course, like the idea of the surface and really, calling attention to that. So, yeah, I think that's pretty much it as far as my presentation. I'm interested in fielding some questions for you if you have some.
Well, I just had a quick observation. I was thinking back to the inverted arch. That's what it was in the plaza.
The tilted arch.
Or the tilted arch. I thought it was interesting just how thinking about that it was thinking about the barrier and that it's made of steel, and just how it harkened to maybe the steel towns, or like thinking about Pittsburgh or Cleveland, the industrial towns that grit aesthetic, and how it was to see that in a New York plaza, which was more use the word corporate, but more.
So it's kind of removed from its context.
Removed from its context, and how I was thinking about how that, you talk about being a barrier, but I thought it was interesting thinking about that in relation to your work of art, with the, you called it was the barrier, right?
Device.
So, sorry, the
Device.
Okay. I'm trying to remember all this.
It's a lot of information.
But yeah, which you were relating to our period of the election, where we had a lot of tension.
Discussion about a barrier, about a wall.
Discussion about the barrier, with different groups. And so anyways, I just thought it was just interesting to me, because just some of that thing you were talking about, the tension in the 1980s with that work of art, and I know it seems to me as though they were kind of, there was some.
Well, there was a big complaint about it, was simply that some people perceived it as being ugly. It was not aesthetic in their eyes. And that raises all these questions too about like the function of art, and then also something early on that I know that I thought about, and I think it's an issue, the idea that art is somehow supposed to be beautiful, and then when you talk about what's beautiful, that raises all sorts of other kind of issues and questions, because we all perceive those things as differently. But then the idea of art being entertainment as well. Those are the two things that you kind of get, I think, I think where art is perceived in a lot of ways is that it's the idea of beauty and entertainment, where, I'd like to think that one of the most potent aspects of art is creating dialogue. So the artwork almost functions as a kind of a prop, as a prop to kind of to stimulate these discussions. Obviously it was impossible to not discuss tilted arc when you talk about Serra's work. It's just so much aspect of his work, but were interesting insights that you have. Anyone else? Yes.
I was a student at Evergreen State College in Olympia.
Yes, I'm familiar with it.
In the 70s, and Richard Serra had a piece that was purchased, I don't know if you're familiar with it, on the campus in front of the art building that was built around 1980 when I was a student there. And it took up almost the entire 1% for art for the new building.
Mm-hmm.
The students were outraged because we just kept thinking, why didn't they buy student art?
Sure.
And put it all over the building for their $10,000 or $12,000 that they spent. And it was a 12-foot square, it looked like a 12-foot square planter box. And the walls were about this big, and they kind of did these minimal changes in height all the way around. And for the longest time, we all just assumed it's not done.
Okay.
Something's going in there. And there was nothing. And I was a sculpture student at the time, and I was outraged by this piece. So I created an art happening in the space. We created a giant fire. We lit a giant sculpture, wooden sculpture on fire.
Okay.
In the middle of it, and fire engines all came, and some of us got this close to being arrested. And
Was this condoned?
fined and-
Was this approved and condoned by a professor? This was like
I was in
a.
the sculpture class at the time. This was very much not.
I think actually Serra would like he would like that. He would like, because I mean a lot of his especially experimental work like in the '60s, he was really kind of expanding his boundaries and working with a lot of artists working in performance, music, happenings. So there was a lot of things like I think there would be approval with that.
It actually changed the conversation about the piece. Like the piece finally had something that wasn't just students being pissed off at its existence.
And it's
Changed
interesting.
the whole conversation about the piece after that, because it was an infamous action on campus.
Interesting. Well, it created not only a controversy but some interesting dialogue.
Yeah, if you're interested, I could dig up a newspaper article.
I would love to see that.
Give it to you.
Yeah, that would be
It
great.
was in the student newspaper.
Please.
A photograph and article about what we did.
Yeah, I would like that, please.
So were all of his steel pieces were all self-supporting, all of them. That curving thing in New York,
Mm-hmm.
self-supporting to its curve and its shape. And they were all like that, I assume.
Yeah, I mean it's through the positioning of them, especially in the pieces where they're arced in a way, and they have like, and he talks about a lot of his work because it's aspects of it is like he works with riggers, he works with, these individuals that are professionals within that field, and obviously he has to think about there's engineers involved. There's a lot of like really kind of complex things that also connect to architecture, though he's very adamant that his work is not architecture, but obviously it does reference it. I think he's comfortable with saying that. But yeah, there's that element to it, but they're designed in a way so that they are self-supporting and able to stand on their own, and obviously very difficult to move.
Yeah. New York had all kinds of buildings built in the 50s and 60s out of ports and steel. Some of those high-rises, sophisticated buildings. This is what was on the exterior
Yes,
at the time.
that's what it was. Obviously that's why the material was originally produced, and then as throughout history, artists take advantage of the new developments in technology and utilize this within their work. And Serra and other artists have definitely done that.
I think that with the welding of this piece also, because that's something that I think a lot about, we've sort of taken away the ability of the piece to die, sort of. Like, I mean, if you have these balanced pieces, part of the work is that they are in this, like, kind of in waiting, that the piece, like, maybe isn't done, because there still could be another action that happens with this, that the piece is no longer propped up, that it falls. And so kind of by welding that, like, we have removed danger, which allows us to keep it here, but it also sort of fulfills like an institutional need for this piece to be eternal. Like, we've like made this investment in it. And I think about that too with the flavin, like when the, like, if the light bulb goes out, is the piece dead? Is it now a piece with a dead light bulb? Or do you replace that? Which of course, we replace them.
I assume those are replaced, but it's very interesting to see, like, and that's kind of I'm glad you you provided that insight on that, because that's the whole kind of thing about the power, I think, of some of these works. Well, I think this still functions strongly as a piece. Obviously, it doesn't have that temporal quality. It doesn't have that danger. Doesn't
The
it?
same like experience, like, I mean, you still can move around it and experience it as a 2D object and move around it as a 3D object, but you don't have the same experience as you would have if you had fear that it may fall and, crush your leg.
It's just, that just the knowledge. I mean, I know I look at those welds. Well, that's putting a lot of weight just on two welds. I know this isn't going to fall over. The fact that if it was something where it's just balanced, it's friction, it's weight, it's gravity holding something, it's going to change how you relate to it. going to change how you move around it. You're going to be very cautious. And yeah, it wouldn't be in this situation. It's just, yeah, obviously, and it's interesting how, that's a whole other thing, it's interesting how artworks, especially artworks that are intended to be ephemeral and to change, and in many cases deteriorate through natural processes, are the kind of lengths that the collections and kind of preservation of artworks within museum collections are the way they're preserved. You know, it's very interesting. Like I think of like, say, some of like Joseph Beuys, like his some of his work, like the fat chair, and his work with like the fat and the way that's preserved. Or I think of like Jana Starbach, who did this flesh vanitas dress. And it's all made out of beef. It's basically a dress that was constructed, that was made of stitched together beef, but it's been preserved in a way that it looks like beef jerky now. So it's very interesting. So I mean, like, no matter what, it doesn't matter if like the artist was like, this is meant to fall apart, this is meant to be temporal, this is meant to be ephemeral. You know, once it's purchased and once it's in the hands of a museum, they're going to go to lengths to preserve it and to kind of deny it that aspect of its life and that time-based element to it, where it's not going to exist anymore.
It seems that a lot of successful contemporary art is non-representational and kind of like the statement over like what it looks like. And I was wondering what you think that came out of and where you think it's going, and your general opinions on successful art now.
Well, I mean, I think you see a lot of artists now, like the delineations between representation, abstraction, art, design, craft. A lot of those things are falling away. You know, a lot of these very firm kind of like categorization and separation of these things. So I would argue that I think that, you know, while I would say that, like, as far as like non-representation or abstraction, it is something that has been embraced, and I talked about that earlier. It's particularly been embraced still, I think, especially in the form of like public artworks, especially in kind of corporate public artworks, institutional public artworks. Because one thing about abstraction is that it differs in representation. In that representation, there's the kind of the semiotics involved and the kind of like the reading of images and symbols, where abstraction doesn't, obviously, while there's a language to that, it's a complex language, it's more ambiguous. It's not something, and so therefore it doesn't have some of these kind of the elements of, potentially like controversial social or political statements, or the way things are read, and people are always going to perceive things differently. So, it's less likely to offend, I think. And it's also, but it's been also, I mean, you think about, let's say 100 years ago, like you think about some of the artists who were starting to embrace abstraction, Cubists, or like, artists who were really kind of moving away from representation. It was very, very controversial thing at the time, and really, was something that was really not not embraced, and it was kind of looked down upon by a lot of individuals, not only the viewing public, but individuals within the art establishment. But as you see now, it's become commonplace. It's become a tradition. There's really no controversy in that right now. So I don't know if I would say that like that's primarily the kind of realm of the successful artists. If anything, I see like now artists like working in a very interdisciplinary way. Like I said, the boundaries are kind of bleeding. You see artists obviously working with both realms of abstraction and representation within the same body of work, oftentimes within the same artwork. So, that's the direction I see it going, is that like you're using these languages, and I know for myself, like when I look at works, and if I see some sort of like thread or connections, if you're talking about like some sort of connectedness or series within a work or conceptual thread, for work to have some similarity to it or somehow some cohesiveness, at least in my eyes, it doesn't have to like look the same. I'm more looking at the kind of the conceptual threads, and I think that that's more the predominant kind of way of perceiving and looking at work now, certainly within the art world.
Just a quick question. Is this thing, is it bolted down on the far side, or could 10 of us pull it and make it drop towards us?
I looked, I mean, I saw no way that this was affixed. I was interested, like, if this was outside, I mean, I assume it might have been out, I don't think it was, it must not have been exhibited in an area that had 24-hour access, I assume, because this piece could be moved. This piece could be tipped forward, theoretically. You know, we're not going to do that, but obviously...
It's not attached on the far end.
I don't know. I see no form of attachment within this piece.
Which is still a little surprising, because 10 people could flip it, or 8 people.
It could be pushed forward.
Yeah.
So it does have that, I mean, it's not so much the danger, but it could be altered. And yeah, it has, it's purely, it's the design and the gravity and the weight that are holding this. And still, I mean, even though it is welded and that takes away some element of it, I still think that it still has, like, the fact that it is this one bar or post holding up, and then also at the same time, this, you know, I can only speculate so much about, like, because aspects of Serra's work, so much of it is that he is trying to, like, have materials and things that he's doing is that they are kind of what they are. You know, it's not a metaphor for something else. It's not like these are like, but there is this kind of like, we always perceive and see work differently than, obviously, as an artist than as the person who generated the work that necessarily perceives. But it's interesting to have these two, especially the way this is balanced and holding up these two, pieces of plate steel, right specifically in the area where they're separated. You know, and there's this, essentially, it looks like about an 8-inch separation between these plates of steel. Another thing about, like, specifically like Serra's work then is, and I thought about this too, is this is essentially like, this is in some ways, some material comes in nominal measurements a lot of times. So, like, you think of like a sheet of plywood, or, you know, like specifically 4 by 8 feet, or a cut in half 4 by 4. There's elements of that, and I think, you know, part of it, these might have come this way, or there might have been, you know, some, it involved one simple cut between that. But typically, this is kind of like the scale and the size, again, like nominal measurements that materials come in. Any more questions? Thank you so much for attending my talk. It was a great experience.